Ladies and gentlemen, free speech is no longer a given in Europe. What we once considered as a natural element of our existence, our birthright, is now something we once again have to battle for. To exercise free speech has become a dangerous activity. As you may know, I will be prosecuted in the Netherlands because of the short documentary Fitna that you just saw, and because of my view concerning what some call a religion of peace. On top of that, also France and Jordan are considering to prosecute me for my view in Islam. And the United Kingdom did not allow me to enter this country. And the president of Indonesia declared for TV in Indonesia that I would never be allowed again in Indonesia to enter Indonesia as long as I live. So let me start tonight with a special thanks to the United States Border Police for letting me into this country. It feels so good being allowed entering a country once in a while. But, ladies and gentlemen, before I talk about freedom of speech, I will say a few words about Islam and Sharia law. Allow me to give you a brief introduction on Islam and Islam 101. And the first thing everybody needs to know about Islam is the importance of the Quran. As you probably know, the Quran calls for submission, for hatred, for violence, for murder, for terrorism, and for war. The Quran calls upon Muslims to kill non-Muslims. The Quran describes Jews as monkeys and pigs. And the biggest problem is that the Quran is to be considered as Allah's personal word, which orders that needs to be fulfilled regardless the place or the time. And that's the reason why the Quran is not open for any discussion or interpretation. It's valid for every Muslim and for all times. And therefore, there is not such a thing as a moderate Islam. Sure, there are a lot of moderate Muslims, I acknowledge that, but a moderate Islam does not exist. I agree with the Turkish Prime Minister for once, Mr. Erdogan, who said there is no moderate Islam. There is only one Islam, and that is the Islam of the book, the Quran. And the second important thing everybody needs to know to understand the Islam is the importance of the so-called Prophet Muhammad. His behavior is an example for all Muslims and cannot be criticized. Well, let me tell you the truth about this so-called prophet anyway. Muhammad indeed was a warlord. He was a conqueror. He was a pedophile, and he was a mass murderer. Islamic traditions tells us how he married and consumed the young girl Aisha before she reached the age of 10 years old. How he fought in battles, how he murdered his enemies, how he slaughtered the Jewish tribe of Banu Qurayza. And for millions of Muslims, the Quran and the life of Muhammad are not ancient history, but are an inspiration. And if you criticize either the Quran or the Prophet or Islam as such, you better be prepared to face the consequences. You will receive death threats from all over the world. You will be taken to court all over the world. Your national flag will be burned, and your embassies might be set on fire. Your country could face economical boycotts, and the political leaders of your own country, your own home country, will not support you, but appease Muslims and Muslim governments. Join them in their politically correct outrage and label you as a radical and a xenophobe. When criticism in Europe today becomes unpleasant, freedom of speech has to take another lane. Ladies and gentlemen, let no one fool you that Islam is a religion. Sure, it has a God, Allah. It has a holy book, the Quran. It has temples, mosques, and even a hereafter. And if you murder enough Jews, you can even get 72 versions. But in essence, in its core essence, Islam is a political ideology. Islam is a totalitarian ideology. It's a system that lays down detailed rules for society and the life of every man and woman. Islam, in fact, wants to dictate every aspect of life and society and prohibits individual, political, and religious rights and freedoms. Islam is not compatible with our Western civilization or democracy, nor will it ever be, because Islam does not want to coexist. It wants to submit and set the entire agenda. Islam means submission from Muslims over non-Muslims, kafirs, like you and me. So there cannot be any mistake about its goal. The end goal of Islam for all time is to dominate. To dominate, and once again, to dominate and establish a world rule of Islam. And that, ladies and gentlemen, that is the reason why Winston Churchill compared the Quran to Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf, as the famous writer Oriana Fallaci did, and why the brave psychiatrist, Dr. Wafa Sultan, I'm so proud that you're here today, ma'am. Really, I'm so proud. That the brave Wafa Sultan rightfully said, and I quote her all the time, about the clash between the West and the Islam, that it's a clash between civilization and backwardness, between the civilized and the primitive, between rationality and barbarity. And the biggest disease in Europe today is called cultural relativism, the political correct misconception that all cultures are equal. Well, let me tell you, all cultures are not equal. Our culture based on Christianity, on Judaism and humanism is far and far better than the Islamic culture, and we should be proud of it. The current Islamization of Europe is not an invasion like those we have seen in the past. This time, it's not a military invasion with swords. This time, we have to deal with a stealth invasion. Nowadays, the armies are replaced by cultural relativism, by demography, and by mass immigration. It is this dangerous cocktail that is the main cause of the Islamization and is responsible for the introduction of Sharia law in Europe. As you know, Sharia is Islamic law, effective in barbaric countries like Saudi Arabia and the Islamic Republic of Iran. Beheadings, hangings, chopping off hands and feet, stoning to death, lashings, it all happens because Sharia law prescribes it. Now, radical Muslims want to implement Sharia law into our Western societies. And they are, unfortunately, very successful in doing so, helped by the Western cultural relativists, the useful idiots, as former Soviet leader Vladimir Lenin described the unknowingly who helped his cause. In my favorite country, Britain, Sharia courts are now officially part of the legal system. A lot of people don't know that. Very few people are aware of that. They have been empowered to adjudicate on financial disputes, on divorces, and on domestic violence. And there are many more examples of the rising of Sharia in Europe today. Halal food is served in many schools and universities. More women every day are forced to wear the burqa or the niqab. Islamic banks are mushrooming, and polygamy, female genital mutilation, honor killings, and Muslim men who refuse to shake hands with women are all part of 2009 Europe. And a few weeks ago, a British Muslim leader told his version of Britain under Sharia law. And according to the British Evening Standard, Anjem Choudary wants a pure Islamic state with Sharia law in Britain. He said that he would like to see the flag of Allah flying over Downing Street. Ladies and gentlemen, this would mean the end of our precious liberties, even though with Gordon Brown in office, one might not see easily the difference. Sharia. Sharia means the end of our hard-won freedom. For Sharia denies the equality of men and women and Muslims and non-Muslims. It does not allow Muslims to leave Islam. Renegades, apostates should be killed according to Islam. Sharia advocates slavery and does not recognize democracy. As a matter of fact, Sharia is exactly the opposite of democracy. And unfortunately, among European Muslims, the support for this creeping Sharia law is indeed substantial. Last year, the British Centre for Social Cohesion released a survey held on the British Muslim students. And some of the outcomes were indeed horrifying. 32% said that killing in the name of Islam is justified. And 40% of the British Muslim students said that they supported the introduction of Sharia law instead of British law. But please, don't think it's only a European problem. We are worse off than the United States, but also in the United States there is a process of Islamization. There are numerous examples. For instance, Muslim cab drivers who refuse to transport passengers possessing alcohol or guide dogs. Muslim students demanding separate housing on campus and separate hours for Muslim women in gyms and swimming pools. And many US journalists who I personally met who told me that they self-censor themselves, being afraid of being sued and taken to court. And as I said, these Muslims are aided by the present-day useful idiots. And the classic example of my own country is the former Attorney General, what we call the Minister of Justice. Just after the Dutch filmmaker and criticaster Theo van Gogh was murdered by a jihadist in the streets of Amsterdam, our former Attorney General was of the opinion, that was his first reaction, that blasphemy should not longer be a dead letter. And a few years later, he even said in the Dutch parliament that he was willing to introduce Sharia if 2/3 of the Dutch people would advocate that. Fortunately, there are also some politicians who are not giving in. Former Republican US Congressman Tom Tancredo is one of those people. Last year, he introduced his Counter-Sharia Jihad Prevention Act. And this bill would bar the entry of people who advocate Sharia law in the United States. And this is exactly what we need. Brave leaders who have the courage to do something against the growing Islamization. Ladies and gentlemen, we have no alternative than to stop the Islamization of the West. Because if we don't, we will roll back for centuries. It will mean the end of our civilization. If we don't act now, we will betray our Western values. We will lose our culture, and we will lose our democracy, and we will lose the dearest of our many liberties, and that is the right to speak our mind. And unfortunately, as I stated in the beginning of my lecture, free speech already is no longer a given in Europe. Last February, I tried to visit Britain, a fellow EU country. I was invited to give a speech in the House of Lords. However, upon arrival in the United Kingdom, I was refused entry. I was detained for a couple of hours in a detention center and then sent back to the Netherlands. But how much would I have loved to be able to remind the British audience of a great man who once spoke in the British House of Commons. In 1982, President Ronald Reagan, the former governor of this great state, California, gave a speech that very few Europeans at that time appreciated. President Reagan called upon the West to reject communism and to defend freedom. He introduced a new phase called evil empire. And President Reagan's speech at that time stands out as a clarion call to preserve our liberties. I quote President Reagan in the House of Commons. He said that if history teaches anything, it teaches self-delusion in the face of unpleasant facts is folly. And what Reagan, of course, meant is that you cannot run away from history. You cannot escape the dangers of ideologies that are out to destroy you. Denial is no option. Communism from the 80s is Islam from today. Ladies and gentlemen, just like the British ban, the decision of the Amsterdam Court of Appeal to prosecute me for fitna and my views on Islam is a major blow dealt to the freedom of speech in Europe. They are full-fledged attacks on freedom of speech in order to appease Muslims. Both are major victories for Islam and for all who hate the freedom of speech. And whether I personally end up in jail is not the most important issue. I gave up my freedom 4.5 years ago when I came under full-time police protection because of death threats from Muslims and terroristic groups like Al-Qaeda. And in the last few years, indeed, I lived in different safe houses, in army barracks, and yes, even in prison cells in order to be safe. But it's not about me. It's not about Geert Wilders. The real question is, will free speech be put behind bars? And we have, ladies and gentlemen, we have to defend the freedom of speech. And I propose the withdrawal of all hate speech legislation in Europe. I propose a European First Amendment. In Europe, we should defend freedom of speech like you Americans do. Recently, I was very proud to be invited and show fitna in the heart of your great democracy in the US Senate on the invitation of Senator Kahl, while in the European Parliament my movie was banned twice, both in Strasbourg and in Brussels. Europe should take America as a model. In Europe, freedom of speech should be extended instead of restricted. And besides the introduction of a European First Amendment, I propose the boycott of the UN Human Rights Council. And not only because the worst violators of human rights, like Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, are members of this council, but also because recently this terrifying council indeed adopted a resolution that attempts to kill free speech and the concept of human rights. This resolution on combating defamation of religions does not protect individuals, but shields Islam for criticism. The resolution calls upon UN member states to provide legal protection against defamation of religions and incitement to religious hatred. And of course, you should read it as no criticism is allowed about Islam. It's a next step, unfortunately, to limit the free speech in our society. So let there be no mistake about this. The UN Human Rights Council is a threat to free speech in the world. Ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately it's a few minutes to 12. In 2009 Europe, Islam is calling for our destruction and free speech is already on trial. If we go on like this, we are heading for the end of European civilization. Unfortunately, many people think like you and me about freedom and liberty. Millions of people in Europe know that liberty is the most precious gift. Freedom-loving people have not yet forgotten to whom we owe our liberties. These were not offered to us on a silver plate, but were bitterly fought for. American soldiers fought, bled, and died for the freedom of Europe. We owe something to these men and women. Their legacy cannot be squandered and given away. American soldiers did not die for an Islamized Europe. They died for a free Europe. We should always remember that. Ladies and gentlemen, if we want to defend our freedom, if we truly want to withstand the evil forces of Islam, if we want to survive, we need less cowards, less dhimmis in the European and American politics, and more heroes. We need to prevail. We need to prevail, and therefore we have to elect new leaders, brave leaders who will protect our values, our culture, leaders who will defend our freedom, leaders who want to stop the cultural relativism and the mass immigration from Muslim and Islamic countries, leaders who indeed are willing to stand up and defy Islam, leaders who are fighters like Winston Churchill, like Margaret Thatcher, like Ronald Reagan, instead of appeasers like Chamberlain and Gordon Brown. We have too many Gordon Browns and Chamberlains in world politics today. Too many politicians who are giving in and giving up and bargaining our freedom away for political or economical benefit. But indeed, let me end up with some good news. The good news is that normal people in Europe, like in my own country, the Netherlands, are increasingly fed up with politicians ignoring our fight for freedom. A growing amount of people want to stop the Islamization of our societies. A growing amount of people want to fight for the freedom of speech and want to preserve the preciousness of our free societies, our rule of law and our democracy, want to give this freedom to their children and their children. And the old political elite in Europe is losing support. New political parties who fight for freedom are gaining strength in many European countries. Like my own party, the Freedom Party. We started as a new party and took part for the first time in the Dutch national elections 2.5 years ago. Then, out of our 10-party system, we have a multi-party system consisting of 10 parties in parliament, we became the 5th party with 9 seats out of the 150-seated lower house in the Netherlands. But in the polls of today, we are the #1 party of Holland with not 9 but 32 parliamentary seats. An enormous increase of support, and many politicians of the old ruling parties in my country almost get a nervous breakdown only by the idea that I might be the next Prime Minister of the Netherlands. So there is panic. There is a big panic in and between the old ruling political parties who thought that they never would be challenged, who thought that they would always be and stay in power. Well, let me tell you, they should be in a panic, because it will only get worse for them, because we will not stop anymore. Not today, not tomorrow. The old times for the old politicians are gone. The public wants something new, and the public will get something new. And we will never stop fighting for freedom. As a matter of fact, the more they threaten us with death threats, with fatwas, or with the legal jihad, the more determined we become to continue. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. And my message to all of those who oppose our fight for freedom is as follows. We will never compromise on freedom. We will never compromise on liberty. We will never appease to Islam anymore. We will never give in. We will never give up. We will never again be submitted to totalitarianism again. Ladies and gentlemen, we can and we should all make a difference, because every individual has a responsibility to make that difference when our freedom is at stake. And we can make a difference. We have the privilege, all of us, to live in a democracy, and we should never take that for granted. We are responsible to preserve our freedom, and we have to take that responsibility at whatever price it may cost. For losing our freedom is no alternative. Freedom is the most precious gift that we have, and we must give it to generations to come. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening. Thank you. Thank you.